30 Days in the Hole. Written, translated and read by Tobin Orber. Chapter 4. Sympathy for the Devils of the Petrograd Side. When I realized that I wanted to write this story, I immediately got in contact with Natasha Drozd. Now she's a film producer at the CTB film company where I used to work, but when we shot The American, she was Selyanov's lawyer, and we went to California together twice to give evidence in court against the actor Michael Biehn. I wanted to check a couple of details with her, the sequence of events, the precise dates, and perhaps most importantly, the statute of limitations on the case. Through some innocent mistake in translation after all, through my poor knowledge of the Russian language, I could make some terrible gaffe. Natasha confirmed that the statute had already run out. Write whatever you want, and immediately added, "I remember your story about the cactus," with a big smile like that at the end of the line. We will eventually get to the cactus. Our story of The American ends under the burning sun of the Nevada desert. Along the way, we'll take in Russia, from Petersburg in the west to Siberia in the east, New York, Las Vegas, San Francisco, and the town where our case was heard, Santa Monica. But that is a long way ahead of us. After we got back from Norilsk, we spent 2 years preparing for our day in court, and that was by no means the last trial in the case. I have a very blurred memory of that time, 10 years before and 10 years after. Some scenes, a lot of them, I can see very clearly, almost perfectly, but I'm much more uncertain about what order it all happened in and how. It's only now that I'm beginning to make sense of it all. That's understandable. I changed hundreds of jobs in that period. There were many events in my personal life. My children were born. I didn't even know about some of them back then, and I drank a fairly large amount. My memory and perception definitely suffered from that. Here's an example. In the year 2000, my friend Kirill Alexeyev moved from Polytechnicheskaya, out in the sticks as it were, to an apartment on the Petrograd side, very close to me. I lived just off Lenin Street. In the 1990s and 2000s, Kirill and I had a hobby. We liked to meet up in the centre of the city by some beautiful monument, buy some beers at the nearest kiosk, load them into our rucksacks, and then, strolling around the city, discuss the architectural and cultural landscape of the most beautiful city in the world, St. Petersburg. We kept the map of its monuments and kiosks where beer was on sale in our heads, and it was continually being updated. Kirill taught ancient Mongolian on the Oriental faculty of St. Petersburg University, so most often we would meet up on the Universitetskaya embankment on Vaska Island and start our walks from there. Most of all, we loved walking in Kolomna and on the Petrograd side. We had favourite scenic spots en route where we would stop, open another bottle, have a smoke and chat. There were also bars and music clubs along the way, and we were ever in search of new monuments and new kiosks. One time, we met by the monument to Lenin on Bolshoi Prospect, and Kirill suggested that, rather than heading straight to the nearest kiosk, first we should go to Lakhtinskaya Street. He'd finally signed the agreement to buy an apartment there, and he wanted to show me the building. He said it was a fascinating piece of architecture with all the classic elements of Petersburg's very own northern modern style. In all honesty, I wasn't over the moon about this suggestion. He himself had just said that there were no kiosks there, but we went to the building on Lakhtinskaya all the same, and Kirill pointed up at the top floor. "Can you see it? There's a little devil up there. I think he's one of the good ones." I rolled my head back to look up, but it was hot and my neck hurt, and I didn't have my glasses on. I'd lost them again, and I honestly couldn't see jack. I was fully aware, however, that this was entirely my problem, so I politely congratulated Kirill and thought, how many more of these wondrous architectural monuments are we going to be visiting before we get to the first historic kiosk? And we continued our walk. Somehow, it slipped my mind that the devil on the roof of Kirill's building, one of the good ones, was the renowned Mephistopheles, an extraordinary work created by the architect Alexander Lishnevsky, a Jew from Kherson in what is now Ukraine. Lishnevsky designed the building, and on the roof he put the face of a devil, modelled on a demonic role created by the opera singer Fyodor Shalyapin. Later, I would live in the room directly under this devil and have an affair with a woman that would save my life. Another 15 years later, a worker would climb up onto the roof of the same building and smash this classic element of northern modern decor, the Mephistopheles of Lishnevsky, off the facade of the 6th floor. It caused a massive scandal in St. Petersburg, with demonstrations, people carrying banners, and much wringing of hands by the city's liberal elite. The talk in the local pubs was that religious fanatics from the new church being built opposite in honour of the patron saint of St. Petersburg, Ksenia the Holy Fool, didn't want Lishnevsky's Mephistopheles looking down upon their place of worship and grinning quite so ironically. So they had his head smashed off with an iron hammer. Ever since, fundamentalist building preservationists and other religious nutcases have been clambering around at all hours on poor Kirill's roof. I spent many nights under that devil, but only had a blurred awareness of him even being there. I only really took note of him and looked him in the eye many years later, long after I'd left the room. It happened just days before he was decapitated. A local historian I knew had somehow got into the bell tower of the new church opposite. From there, he took a powerful series of photographs, which I shared online, writing that I'd previously lived in the room below the devil. A friend, an American, Alec Loon, saw my post and shared the same photographs. Alec had interned with me when I was the editor-in-chief of the St. Petersburg Times, and he lived in the room after me. I could write a whole book about the interns, journalists, writers and editors that I've worked with in Russia, but that would be a very different story of freaks and men. In this chapter, I will limit myself to 2. At the paper where I worked, Western interns were for the most part walk-ins, students who were living in St. Petersburg and just wanted to hang out and give journalism a try. But there were also students like Alec Loon. He'd arranged his internship with us well in advance from back in America, and he arrived fully prepared to do a professional job. As the editor-in-chief, I always regarded myself as a complete amateur in a very cosy spot, but Alec took what we were doing seriously. Very quickly he became one of the most successful Western correspondents in Russia. He wrote for The Guardian, The Independent and The Telegraph, and he was the first journalist, Russian or foreign, to ask Vladimir Putin a direct question about the opposition leader Alexei Navalny, the Navalny who was tortured to death in a Russian prison in Siberia just a few months ago. Alec managed to doorstop the president of the Russian Federation in a corridor at one of Putin's annual meetings for journalists, traditionally held in the Valdai region, where I used to go on holiday at the time. I'm writing all this to explain one thing. When we flew back from Norilsk, all of us went back to our daily lives, where each of us was living under some devil all of our own. As I've said, my memory of that period is blurred, but there's a lot that I can make out. I can see some very clear pictures and scenes and hope to tie them together in the story of the American and his 30 days in the hole. I was in a very poor physical and emotional state when I flew back to St. Petersburg from Norilsk, but I still wanted to be a writer and I knew which direction I had to move in. My favourite word in Russian is khaltura in every sense of the word. Khaltura is work you do on the side, moonlighting, odd jobbing, filling in, but it can also mean very shoddy work that lacks professionalism. I believe that the 1990s and 2000s in Russia were the era of khaltura. Following the fall of the Soviet Union, everyone was trying themselves in new roles, and I found it fascinating. I would always immediately agree to any and all offers of work in any sphere, and by the time I got back from Norilsk, my odd jobbing was focused on 2 main fields. For obvious reasons, I wanted to stay as far away from film as I could, but in my other main field, journalism, I'd come back at a good moment. Just before we'd left for New York to start shooting The American with Michael Biehn, I'd been offered the job of editor-in-chief at a city lifestyle magazine, Pulse, published in Russian and English in St. Petersburg. I'd done Khaltura there from the moment of its creation in 1995 and had gone on to become the editor of the English version. Pulse was a lifestyle and arts magazine, and many of the writers and editors who went through there are now well known in select Russian circles. I turned down the offer of editor-in-chief because I'd already given my word to Balabanov and Selyanov that we would all go and shoot the American. Pulse couldn't wait for me, so the management had given my job to a young Russian journalist who spoke good English, but they were already having problems with him. As soon as I got back from Norilsk, I went straight from the airport to Pulse's editorial offices in the House of Architects on the Moika embankment and got my job back as editor of the English version. But I wasn't editor-in-chief. In all the media companies in the city back then, a bitter war was being fought between the post-perestroika generation of young journos and the money-grabbing, short-sighted managers of the advertising departments. Pulse's advertising managers were, putting it mildly, unhappy with the line being taken by its new editor-in-chief. But you couldn't really blame the advertising managers either. Until very recently, all of the key figures in the magazine's advertising department had been working in state research institutes within the military-industrial complex, where they'd been designing components for intercontinental ballistic missiles. Today, they were supposed to be tempting advertisers with attractive sales propositions in a sophisticated glossy magazine. But yesterday, their entire working lives had consisted of developing and perfecting systems for the mass annihilation of vast swathes of the Earth's population. We had a wonderful advertising manager, albeit not a terribly successful one, who'd come to his new profession as an advertising salesman direct from the Faculty of Scientific Communism, where he had taught courses and given lectures on Marxist dialectics. A very tall, very handsome Armenian with a shining black beard, Grisha Vartanov shifted advertising blocks in our magazine with phenomenal difficulty. He would construct complex, multi-stage schemes to sell advertisers a half page, even just a tiny module deep in the basement, far into the back pages. The new direction being taken by the editorial team was only making a job he was already struggling with even worse. The advertising department's patience was finally broken when, in his second issue, the new editor, across a full double-page spread, published a collection of his own poems, which is never a good idea. Credit where credit is due. At the subsequent office meeting, hardcore Marxist Grisha Vartanov said that the editor was quite talented and he'd enjoyed some of the poems. But the advertising department's military-industrial bloc insisted on the total liquidation of the editor-in-chief. They had some very long meetings with the magazine's Finnish owner, a man who took even the most obvious of decisions with an excruciating amount of deliberation, and they convinced him to replace the magazine's editor-in-chief, which was just after I got back from Norilsk. For me, Pulse magazine was non-stop sunshine reggae from the beginning in 1995 right through to the very end. Norman Mailer wrote in his novel The Executioner's Song, based on the life and execution of the murderer Gary Gilmore, that when you arrive in a new town to do a story, the first thing you do is get in with the local newspaper. It opens all the doors. For me, first and foremost, that meant the doors to all the bars and clubs in the great city of St. Petersburg. But there were other bonuses. For example, I really wanted to know how to get a gun, what the local rules were, and who controlled the country's gun market. I started to research the article and soon found myself at the Admiralty District Police Station on Yakubovich Street, in front of a police officer in a big round police hat, the shape and size of a very large family-sized pizza. The officer explained that as a foreign citizen, I didn't have the right to possess a firearm, and Russian citizens didn't have that right either, apart from hunters and sportsmen who had to go through a special procedure. I asked, "Are there any exceptions?" The officer, he was about 10 or 15 years older than me, gave a loud sigh, got up and took his copy of the Criminal Code of the Russian Federation down from the shelf. He opened it up and, in a monotonous tone, he began to read me an article from it. On reaching his pension, an officer of the law enforcement agencies can receive a working handgun from his department as a mark of recognition for his years of service. So the only people packing heat are cops and ex-cops. I asked the officer, "Is that for self-defense, in case some nasty story crops up from the copper's past?" The officer looked at me with a great deal of irritation and said, very slowly, "I don't write the laws, I just read them to you." The next interview I did was with a half-blind elderly man who was very lively but quite cranky. He immediately started boasting to me about the ingenious silencer he'd invented, manufactured and fitted to his double-barreled shotgun. I was slightly taken aback. Why do you need a silencer for a shotgun? The old man explained that his dacha, a Russian country house, often little more than a big shed, was on a very small plot of land, neighbours on all sides, and they didn't like him shooting duck from his back garden. There'd been complaints. There were many more joys at Pulse. For the most part, the magazine earned its keep selling adverts to the local hotels, bars, clubs and restaurants. So, as well as being able to get into various concerts, art shows and promotional events for free, I could also pick up more khaltura, jobs on the side, along the way. I started editing glossy magazines for all of the 5-star hotels in St. Petersburg, and that opened yet more doors. Living on the Petrograd side, just north of the Peter and Paul Fortress, working on the Moika River embankment, close to St. Isaac's Cathedral, I also became the editor-in-chief of the largest publication on the Caribbean island of St. Bart. The island is all of 30 square kilometres. St. Bart is also known as America's Saint-Tropez, the favourite resort of the American elite. The Rockefellers began popularising it among the uber-rich in the 1960s and 70s. Alleged business genius and former Chelsea owner Roman Abramovich used to host his famous New Year's Eve parties on Gouverneur Beach there, with the likes of Prince, Beyoncé and Gwen Stefani playing on the same night for an audience of just 400. And I was there too. It was a nice bit of khaltura that allowed me to study the bars, clubs and hotels on the island in depth. With Pulse, there were other trips abroad. At the beginning of the 2000s, the price for oil shot up, the ruble grew stronger, and Russians began to feel it in their pockets. Wider sections of society began travelling abroad and further afield. A few months after I was appointed editor-in-chief at Pulse, the Tourism Ministry of Indonesia invited a group of St. Petersburg journalists on a tour of the island of Bali. 2 weeks on the beach and in the bars of a tourist paradise with an elite team of dedicated investigative reporters, everything on the house. It was khaltura heaven, and I even managed to sign my wife up in the role of magazine photographer. Despite the fact that she'd never held a camera in her life, you didn't have them on phones back then, and she was 7.5 months pregnant. Which is to say that where Me Too was concerned, we were well ahead of the game at Pulse magazine. Pulse helped me with other issues of vital importance. In the year that I got back from Norilsk, our photographer, my wife Nastya, was pregnant with our first son, and a question arose as to where she should give birth. I cut a deal with the advertising department, and we prepared to do a special issue devoted to state maternity hospitals, elite private clinics and every other option available on the market, throwing an entire team of journalists into researching it. I soon found myself, notepad in hand, speaking to Yelena Yermakova, the head of a centre for parental culture named Kolybelka, the Cradle. Yelena explained to me that you have to give birth in your own home, in a blow-up swimming pool, the kind that toddlers splash about in and often get left out in the garden, where they deflate and collect leaves and dirt. Shortly after the interview and the publication of our special issue, Yelena was sentenced to 5 years in prison for illegally carrying out home births that resulted in the deaths of 6 children and the crippling of another 2. There were other adventures. Once, working undercover, I went to a party thrown by a marriage agency catering to foreigners picking out Russian brides. I had a really great evening. I got to drink for the whole night for free, and I'm always open to making new acquaintances. I also loved the geographical location of our editorial offices. Pulse was housed in the House of Architects with a wonderful view out onto the Moika River. Our magazine's main competitor, the St. Petersburg Times, was located a 5-minute walk away on the other side of St. Isaac's Square, in the All-Russian Institute of the Plant Industry, where my good friend Matt Brown worked as arts editor. Matt had been to the same university as me, also studying film, and he was also very enthusiastic about working as a journalist in Russia's northern capital. Between our two offices, in a cellar on Bolshaya Morskaya, there was a bar that Matt and I called the Second Office, a place where English-language editors from across the city could meet up to discuss the pressing cultural, political and social issues of the day. Not far off, down a side street off the Moika River, was another favourite bar of city journalists from back then, the Cynic, and a 10-minute walk on top of that got you to what was the main bar street in St. Petersburg back then, Doomskaya. I was also very suited to Pulse's working schedule. We had to file an issue every 30 days. For the first 3 weeks of each month, the editorial team would hang out in bars, clubs and restaurants, carrying out painstaking and highly objective research. Then, in order to get the issue ready in the space of a week, our team would launch a fearsome alcoholic blitzkrieg. My colleagues at Pulse were another joy. True, our favourite advertising agent, the former doctor of scientific communism and breaker of women's hearts, Grisha Vartanov, left us. He married a very nice woman, the Norwegian consul, and moved to her homeland. Grisha said that he'd always loved fishing. Some of us loved the job too much. Ilyas Vasipov, the editor of our Russian version, went up to the great bar in the sky far too early. I particularly liked the working style of another of our writers, the historian Yuri Peryutka, who wrote The Other Petersburg, the first history of homosexuality in the city. He too worked himself into an early grave. For my part, I remained a functional alcoholic, and quite a successful one in fact. After a year and a half editing Pulse, I was invited to become editor-in-chief at the St. Petersburg Times, and I moved across St. Isaac's Square to an office overlooking the Mariinsky Palace, which housed the city's parliament. I worked there as editor-in-chief for about 10 years or something like that, often moonlighting on the other side of St. Isaac's back at Pulse. That meant I couldn't work on film sets anymore, with rare and brief exceptions, but it opened up a whole new set of doors, especially where Khaltura was concerned. The St. Petersburg Times was regarded as a far more serious publication, part of independent media, the largest print holding in Russia. We had a sister paper, the Moscow Times. At the end of the 1990s, it was the country's fourth most profitable publication. It was a bastion of liberal values where they truly believed in the sacred duty of the Fourth Estate, journalism. I didn't work too badly over those 10 years. I started a family. I built a large house with 10 bedrooms and a heated swimming pool in one of the city's very well-to-do suburbs. My neighbours were the governor of St. Petersburg, Valentina Matvienko, and Alexei Miller, the head of Gazprom, at the time one of the largest companies in the world. But I knew that this wasn't really my profession. From time to time, I was given a stark reminder that I had other work to do. Take, for example, the promised story of the Second Intern. Usually at the Times, interns would come to us in bunches. For the most part, they were American students on college programs that required spending a year or at least a semester abroad. 10 or 12 of them would suddenly turn up and you had to find something for them to do. Peter Kasich stood out among these students. He had very light, pale skin, almost like an albino, and he was very thin. There wasn't a gram of fat on him, and he looked like a ghost. He was older than the other interns, and he had a very different energy. He was much younger than me, but we would chat while we were reading the proofs, looking for mistakes late at night when we were getting the issue ready to print. Pete was born and grew up out in the sticks in the USA, in the state of Indiana, where he'd been adopted. After school, he immediately joined the professional army, where he became a ranger. This was a special forces unit, and that immediately opened up a whole range of conversations between us. When I asked him what his specialty was, he modestly replied, insertion and extraction. We both practiced martial arts. I did Thai boxing, and he did whatever it was they taught him in his unit, a mixture of different systems which we discussed. And we were both runners. Shortly before meeting Pete, smoking 3 packs a day and whilst being a functional alcoholic, I ran my first marathon. I won't tell you how long it took. The main thing was that I'd survived to tell the tale. Pete said that he'd never trained specifically for a marathon, but his commander, right at the last moment, had entered all his guys in a race in the town that neighboured on the base, and he'd run the full 26 miles in 2 hours and 53 minutes. That's very fast. And of course, we discussed Michael Biehn and the film The American. In the 1980s in Aliens, the director James Cameron created a fashion for a new hero that suited the era, the Special Forces guy. Despite the difference in our ages, Pete and I had grown up on all of that. In cinematic terms, we were children of much the same generation. In Aliens, in the role of Hicks, Michael Biehn commands a highly trained, high-tech equipped team of professional killers of the future. Biehn would repeat the role for Cameron in the film The Abyss, where he played the commander of another elite American unit, the US Navy SEALs. In fact, he would also star in a film specifically dedicated to the Navy SEALs, alongside another big-screen warrior of his generation, Charlie Sheen. Michael became the benchmark for a new generation of heroes, the professionals. First there were cowboys who solved problems quickly and simply with the aid of a Colt 45 and didn't really fret about it. Then soldiers appeared, returning from war traumatized. De Niro in Taxi Driver, Sylvester Stallone in Rambo, and much, much later, the bastardized Russian version, Balabanov's Danila Bagrov in the Brother films, the most successful of which I'd worked on as a producer. And then came the warriors of the future, such as Kyle Reese in Terminator, which is to say Michael Biehn, the American in the story that you're now reading. Highly competent but stressed out and on the edge, saving humanity is hard work. Pete told me that he'd fought in Iraq and then, on some army program, he'd got a place at university, so now he was spending a semester in St. Petersburg. From what he said, it was clear that something bad had happened to him in Iraq, so he'd come home early. Later I read that he'd been given a medical discharge. A friend of mine was head of his student group while he was in Petersburg, and not long after he left, she told me about an incident involving Pete. She'd taken the group on an excursion to Helsinki, and on the way back on the train, Pete had tried to kill himself. He did his semester of work experience with us in a soldierly fashion, always came in on time and did his duty, and then he went home, but we stayed in touch, writing to each other occasionally. Back in America, Pete got into some sort of trouble for illegally carrying a weapon across the state border, but somehow he'd managed to get off. Then he got married to a sweet-looking girl, and I congratulated him. And then he suddenly popped up in Beirut, already divorced. He told me that he had found his real job. He became a volunteer, you could call it a missionary, taking medical aid to refugees in difficult-to-access, dangerous areas in the Middle East. I was getting into running more and more, doing back-to-back marathons, and Pete and I chatted about it. We agreed that I would come to Beirut and we would run the marathon together there. But his letters and posts on social media were becoming worrying. He would often write along the lines of, "Here I am again, climbing into the trunk of a car to cross the border. Another night and maybe another day at work. Bye." That was how he wrote about what he considered to be his life's work. Later, when I worked at CNN with their chief military correspondent, Fred Pleitgen, Fred told me that all the correspondents in Beirut knew Pete and they were very worried about him. Some more time passed. At first, Pete and I would write to each other quite often, then less so, and then sometimes I would remember that I hadn't heard from him in a while. By then I was no longer working at the Times, I just helped out when somebody was ill or away on holiday. One night I was in the editorial offices helping to put the issue out, and I had to quickly find 3 articles and a photograph to put on the World news page. I'm looking at my screen, skimming down the news feed, and I find the picture. A terrorist is standing in a desert, his arm is stretched out in front of him, and he's holding a decapitated head. The man is clearly posing for the camera. I read the caption for the photograph. It was the head of an Englishman, Alan Henning. ISIS had kidnapped and executed him, and they were promising that the next hostage to die would be an American. My friend, Pete Kassig. I started following the news. I think they said that the next hostage would be killed in a week's time, but I'm not sure. It seemed like a lot longer. Every time I turned on my computer, I would do a search looking for him. They wrote in the news that negotiations were being held, or that they weren't, and his parents were pleading for Pete to be released. My main place of work at the time was at Petersburg's television centre on Ulica Chapigina. One day, I got to work, turned on my computer, and Pete's severed head almost rolled out of the screen and onto the desk in front of me. Pete's head was stopped from falling by his executioner's boot, that of another Englishman, a terrorist nicknamed Jihadi John. The foreign hostages had been guarded by 4 ISIS terrorists who'd grown up in England and spoke to their prisoners with native English accents. The hostages, while waiting their turn, sent letters home to their families in which they called these terrorists the Beatles. Jihadi John, or John Beetle, was their leader. Shortly before he was executed, Pete adopted the Muslim faith, and in his letters he asked his parents to call him Abdul Rahman Kassig. So ends the story of the Second Intern. I was fascinated by everything that concerned my career in journalism before and after Norilsk. I'm very grateful to all the people I worked with and met back then. For me, it was ideal khaltura, but I knew that it wasn't my real job. I still had that to do. What's more, I'd given my word to the devil on the Petrograd side. When we first got back from Norilsk and I was offered the job of editor at Pulse, and when a year and a half later I was offered the job of editor at the Times, and in all the other odd jobs along the way, I always said that I was free and I could start work immediately. I never haggled about money once. But I always said, almost as an aside, that there was one condition. At some point, I'd have to go to California to appear in court and give evidence against an American. Against the one who was in Terminator, but not Arnie. I said that I'd given my word to the top producer at the Len Film Studios on the Petrograd side. I'd given my word to Sergei Mikhailovich Selyanov. Written and read by Tobin Orba. Edited by Katya Orba. Music by Karabasi. Sound Zhenya Pestrikov. To be continued.